casual 2.3k and a tier 5. You know, as you do. Okay, so auto bounce, I'll use Salem. Auto bounce is the angle in which a normal shell will bounce 100% of the time that it doesn't overmatch. So let's take our Salem, and he is bow on. So any shells hitting his bow are going to hit at a 0-degree angle. Any shell from a destroyer is going to bounce. Any shell from a cruiser is going to bounce. Any shell from a battleship that is under 381 millimeters is also going to bounce. The overmatch calculation is shell caliber being fired divided by 14.3, and then you compare that to the armor itself. And this is only for armor piercing, because high explosive is much easier. It either can penetrate the armor or it can't. So that's a simple yes or no. And that has either 1/6 or 1/4 pen, and that's listed under the HE shell itself. You can see there it says HE shell armor penetration capacity, and it's 33 millimeters. So, for US heavy cruisers, as well as German cruisers at high tiers, they have 27 millimeters of bow armor. What that means is they only get overmatched by ships that have 385 millimeter or larger guns. Effectively, 16-inch guns and up. So those guns, no matter how much you angle, if they hit you on the bow, they are always going to ignore your armor and punch straight through. And then going to do any other characteristics, so depending on where they hit, they'll either penetrate or citadel or possibly overpen. Now, if you're angled 30 degrees, so this is about 30 degrees, a normal battleship shell is still going to overmatch this. A battleship shell shorter than 381 millimeters is going to bounce. Because normal shells bounce at 30 degrees. That's their normal overmatch. Oh, that's their normal auto bounce angle. Now, exceptions to this. Duke of York, I believe. Hood, I believe. The battleship exceptions are weird. US heavy cruisers, British destroyers, British cruisers. So, US heavy cruisers will still automatically pen at 30 degrees. And they won't start to auto bounce check until you're angled slightly over 30 degrees. And then at 22.5 degrees is when they will automatically bounce. So if you see a Des Moines, a Salem, New Orleans, a Pensacola, Wichita, Baltimore, Buffalo, any of those ships, you have to angle a little more towards them. British cruisers, their angles are even better. Basically, all you have to know is that you have to be more or less completely bow on or completely stern on in order to bounce those. Stalingrad also has better auto pen angles, just slightly improved over the regular. It's not as good as the US carrier or the US cruisers, but it's only like a 2 to 3 degree difference. British destroyers also get slightly improved angles, but against most cruisers, they're never going to citadel you. Now, just because you're stern on doesn't mean you're safe, because as you can see on the Salem and a lot of other cruisers, they have very, very flat sterns. So while it's kind of hard to hit directly on the stern in a way that's going to pen, if a shell hits this, even though you might be angled at 0 degrees to them, it's still hitting a flat surface, so it is still going to penetrate. So that's why Stalingrad wrecks your shit in Akaba. It's a combination of Stalingrad has short fuse AP. No, it doesn't. It has improved armor. Does Stalingrad have short fuse? It's been so long since that thing came out, I can't even remember. But yes, Stalingrad's shells only need 50 degrees of armor of 51 degrees, I believe, of effective armor to arm. Because that's another thing. That's another thing that I haven't touched on at all, is effective armor. This matters, well, it matters mostly because the angling checks don't stop when you are angled over 30 degrees. Even if a shell hits you and doesn't bounce at 30 degrees, it then moves on to a penetration check. Now, this doesn't check the raw angle unless you are 100% broadside and firing at point blank where the shell is flat. Because if the shell isn't coming in at a completely flat angle, it's not going to hit 180 millimeters of armor. Because if the shell is coming in at an angle like this, it's going to have to go through more armor. Right? So if you're going through this much armor and the shell's coming in this way, you're not going through this much armor, you're going through this much armor, right? Does that make sense? Stalingrad has fast shells and Cobb takes full damage from AP. Yes, so not only that, Kaba, if I remember correctly, also gets overmatched by Stalingrad. So what Stalingrad can do, even if you're bow on, it's going to overmatch the 19mm plating. If you're very, very lucky, it will overmatch, punch straight through because it won't arm, and then go out the other end. But that very rarely happens. Because often, when shells overmatch, they're not going straight through exactly 19mm of armor. Because of the angling, it's cutting through more armor. Like I said, with the penetration depends on the distance and trajectory. So yes, it depends on the distance and the trajectory, as well as other factors such as the crop value and the size of the shell, as well as the weight. That's a calculator that is very effective for calculating close to accurate penetration at distances for pretty much every ship. But going back to specifically Kaba, what'll happen a lot is Stalingrad only needs a tiny bit of angling to arm on the 50mm plate in the Kaba. Krupp is an artificial value decided by Wargaming that is effectively the hardness of a shell. The standard Krupp value that adds no bonuses to penetration is 2400. So if a shell has 2400 Krupp, it has no extra penetration and it doesn't lose any penetration. Anything over 2400 is going to gain percentages of penetration. So a 2500 shell is going to have about 10% more, if I remember correctly, than a 2400 Krupp shell. Similarly, a 2300 Krupp shell is going to lose that 10%. And as you go farther and farther down the Krupp, it really starts to hurt. For example, I believe Wyoming stock shells have something around 400 or 1400 Krupp, and they're some of the worst penetrating shells for their caliber in the entire game. Kingpin University. How it works, the Kingpin version. Yeah. So the reason Stalingrad specifically wrecks Kaba is because the value that an AP shell needs to arm, in most cases, is 1/6 of its caliber. And that's not regular armor, that's effective armor. So basically, Stalingrad AP shells arm on 51mm of armor. Kaba has 50mm of armor, and it gets overmatched in the 19mm section. So very often what will happen is, unless you are completely 100% at a 90-degree angle, flat broadside to a Stalingrad, even the tiniest bit of angling is going to arm his shell. And even though the shells are fast, it's still probably going to explode inside your ship, leading to a full penetration. Prize an old stock Azumo. Oof. Yeah. So that was a basic rundown of penetration and angling and overmatch in kind of the simplest terms I can do it. So you would have to give flat broadside to Stalin. Yes, so if you're in a Kaba and you see a Stalin thirsting for your booty, you're going to want to go full broadside to him. Because other than that, he's just going to wreck your day completely. One thing to note, by the way, British cruisers have 16mm plating. That gets overmatched by every gun that is 240mm or larger. So Henri shells are going to overmatch Minotaur. Just something to keep in mind if you're playing Minnow, or if you're playing Henri, or if you're playing any of the super cruisers.